David was just a teenager, the youngest in his family, overlooked and underestimated by everyone around him. Yet he would face a giant warrior who had terrorized entire armies, armed with nothing but a sling and stones, while thousands of seasoned soldiers watched from the sidelines. This is the story of David and Goliath, one of the most famous underdog victories in human history, but it's so much more than just a tale of the small defeating the mighty. It's a story about faith, courage, and what happens when ordinary people trust an extraordinary God. Our story begins in the hill country of Israel, around 3,000 years ago, during the reign of King Saul. Israel was still a relatively young nation, having transitioned from a loose confederation of tribes to a monarchy only a few generations earlier. The Israelites were surrounded by hostile neighbors who constantly threatened their borders, their freedom, and their very existence as God's chosen people. To the west lived the Philistines, perhaps Israel's most persistent and dangerous enemies. These weren't just raiders or bandits. The Philistines were a sophisticated civilization with advanced military technology, superior weapons, and a warrior culture that had dominated the region for generations. They controlled the coastal plains and were constantly pushing inland, trying to expand their territory at Israel's expense. The Philistines had one crucial advantage that made them nearly unstoppable. They had mastered ironworking technology, while the Israelites were still largely dependent on bronze weapons and agricultural tools. Iron was stronger, held a sharper edge, and could be fashioned into more effective armor and weapons. The Bible tells us that the Philistines jealously guarded this technology, not allowing any smiths in Israel, forcing the Israelites to come to Philistine territory even to sharpen their farming tools. Into this world of constant military tension and technological disadvantage was born a boy named David in the small town of Bethlehem. He was the youngest of 8 sons born to a man named Jesse, and in the cultural hierarchy of ancient Israel, that meant he was essentially invisible. The oldest son inherited most of the father's property and responsibility. The younger sons had to find their own way in the world, and the youngest often got whatever tasks no one else wanted. For David, that meant spending long, lonely days in the hills around Bethlehem, tending his father's sheep. This wasn't the romanticized shepherding we might imagine from children's Bible stories. Sheep in ancient Palestine faced constant threats from wild animals, lions, bears, wolves, and hyenas that would attack the flock whenever they found an opportunity. A shepherd's job was part caretaker, part soldier, and part wilderness survival expert. David learned to be comfortable with solitude, spending weeks at a time alone except for his sheep. He learned to read the landscape, to find water and shelter, to predict weather patterns. Most importantly, he learned to defend his flock with whatever tools he had available. The shepherd's sling was a childless toy. It was a precision weapon that could kill a wolf at 100 paces or bring down a charging bear with one well-placed stone. During those long days and nights in the wilderness, David developed an intimate relationship with God. He composed songs and poems that would later become many of the Psalms, pouring out his heart in worship, expressing his fears and hopes, and learning to trust completely in God's protection and provision. The hills around Bethlehem became his sanctuary, his classroom, and his training ground for challenges he couldn't yet imagine. Meanwhile, the political situation in Israel was deteriorating rapidly. King Saul, who had started his reign with such promise, was struggling with what appears to have been severe mental illness, possibly depression or bipolar disorder. He was making increasingly erratic decisions. His relationship with God had broken down, and his leadership was becoming unstable. The Philistines sensed weakness and began pressing their military advantage more aggressively. The confrontation that would change everything began in the Valley of Elah, a strategic location southwest of Jerusalem where the hills of Judah met the coastal plains controlled by the Philistines. The two armies had taken positions on opposite sides of the valley, close enough to see each other clearly but separated by terrain that made a direct assault dangerous for either side. It was a military stalemate, but the Philistines had a secret weapon that would break the deadlock in the most dramatic way possible. From their ranks stepped a warrior whose very appearance struck terror into the hearts of Israel's soldiers. His name was Goliath of Gath, and he stood over 9 feet tall, a giant by any standard, but especially intimidating in an ancient world where the average man might have been 5.5 feet tall. Goliath wasn't just tall, he was a walking arsenal. His armor alone weighed about 125 pounds, crafted from the finest bronze and fitted perfectly to his massive frame. His spear was like a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron point that weighed 15 pounds, more than most soldiers' entire weapon. He carried a javelin between his shoulders, and was preceded by a shield bearer who carried defensive equipment almost too heavy for a normal man to lift. But Goliath's most effective weapon wasn't his spear or his armor. It was his voice and his intimidating presence. Every morning for 40 days, he would stride into the valley between the two armies and issue a challenge that echoed off the hills like thunder. "Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me," he would roar. "If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." This wasn't just military posturing, it was psychological warfare at its most effective. Goliath was proposing single combat to determine the outcome of the entire conflict. Winner takes all. One fight to decide whether Israel would remain free or become enslaved to the Philistines. And every day for 40 days, not a single Israelite soldier was willing to accept the challenge. Imagine the humiliation and fear that gripped the Israelite army. Here were seasoned warriors, men who had fought in numerous battles, professional soldiers who understood the science of warfare. Yet none of them, not the strongest, not the most experienced, not even the most faithful, was willing to face this giant. Every morning they heard his taunts. Every evening they went to sleep with his challenge ringing in their ears. And every day their national pride died a little more. King Saul himself, who was described as head and shoulders taller than any other Israelite, might have been the logical choice to face Goliath. But Saul's confidence was broken, his relationship with God was severed, and his mental state was too fragile for such a momentous confrontation. The very man who should have been leading his people into battle was paralyzed by the same fear that gripped his soldiers. During these 40 days of standoff, life continued in Bethlehem. David was still out in the hills with the sheep, probably unaware of the military crisis unfolding just a day's journey from his home. His three oldest brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had joined Saul's army and were among the soldiers listening to Goliath's daily challenges and feeling their courage evaporate a little more each day. Then Jesse, David's father, made a decision that would change the course of history. He was concerned about his sons serving in the army, and he wanted to send them supplies, roasted grain, bread, and cheese, along with gifts for their commanding officer. But who could he send on this mission? His older sons were already with the army. His middle sons had their own responsibilities, and that left only David. "Take this food to your brothers," Jesse told David, "and see how they are doing. Bring back news of whether they are safe and well." It seemed like a simple errand, the kind of task that would naturally fall to the youngest son. No one imagined that this routine family mission would lead to one of the most famous battles in human history. David left his sheep with another shepherd and set out early in the morning for the valley of Elah, carrying his father's gifts and probably looking forward to seeing his brothers after weeks of separation. He arrived at the Israelite camp just as the armies were taking their positions for another day of fruitless confrontation, just as Goliath was preparing to deliver his daily challenge. The moment David heard Goliath's voice echoing across the valley, something ignited in his spirit that none of the professional soldiers had felt. While everyone else heard an impossible challenge from an unbeatable enemy, David heard something entirely different. He heard someone defying the army of the living God. The giant was NT just challenging Israel's military might. He was insulting the God that David had learned to trust completely during all those lonely nights in the wilderness. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asked, and his question revealed the fundamental difference between his perspective and everyone else's. The soldiers were looking at Goliath and comparing him to themselves, and finding themselves hopelessly outmatched. David was looking at Goliath and comparing him to God, and finding the giant pitifully small. David began asking questions about the situation, and what he learned amazed him. King Saul had offered incredible rewards for anyone who would face Goliath: great riches, marriage to the king's daughter, and tax exemption for the winner's entire family. These were life-changing rewards, the kind of offer that should have motivated dozens of volunteers. Yet still, no one was willing to fight. When David's oldest brother Eliab heard him asking these questions, he exploded in anger. "Why have you come down here?" he demanded. "Who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart. You came down to see the battle." The oldest brother was projecting his own shame and fear onto David, embarrassed that his little brother was asking questions that made all the soldiers look cowardly. But David wouldn't be silenced or intimidated, not even by his older brother. He had heard something in Goliath's challenge that stirred his faith to action, and he began making his way toward King Saul to volunteer for single combat. Word spread quickly through the camp. The shepherd boy from Bethlehem wanted to fight the giant. When David was brought before King Saul, The contrast must have been almost comical. Here was Israel's king, a tall and imposing figure wearing royal armor and surrounded by his military advisors, looking down at a teenager who probably still smelled like sheep and had calloused hands from handling a sling. Saul's first response was exactly what you'd expect. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David had an answer that revealed the source of his confidence. He began telling Saul about his experiences as a shepherd, about the times when lions and bears had attacked his flock, and how he had killed them with his bare hands and his sling. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear," David declared, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." This wasn't youthful bravado or naive optimism. This was faith based on experience. David had already faced life and death situations in which he was completely outmatched by natural standards, and he had learned that God's power was more than sufficient to overcome any enemy. The same God who had enabled him to kill a charging bear would enable him to defeat an armored giant. Saul, perhaps desperate enough to try anything after 40 days of humiliation, gave his permission. But first, he tried to equip David with the best armor and weapons available, the king's own battle gear. David strapped on Saul's armor, took his sword, and tried to walk, but the equipment was too heavy, too cumbersome, and completely unfamiliar. "I cannot go with these," David told Saul, "for I have not tested them." He took off the armor and instead picked up his shepherd's staff, his simple leather sling, and 5 smooth stones from a nearby brook. Think about the faith and wisdom that decision required. David was about to face the most feared warrior in the region, a man whose bronze armor could turn aside sword blades and spear points. And he chose to fight with the simple tools he knew how to use rather than sophisticated weapons he could handle effectively. He understood that victory would come through divine power channeled through familiar skills, not through superior equipment that he didn't know how to use. As David walked down into the valley, both armies watched in stunned silence. The Philistines probably couldn't believe that Israel was sending a boy to fight their champion. The Israelites probably couldn't believe that one of their own was actually accepting Goliath's challenge, even if it was just a shepherd with a sling. When Goliath saw David approaching, his reaction was one of insulted rage. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" He roared, cursing David by his gods. The giant was offended that Israel would send someone so young and apparently harmless to face him. It seemed like a deliberate insult, a sign that the Israelites weren't taking his challenge seriously. But David's response revealed the spiritual dimension of this confrontation that everyone else was missing. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin," David called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head." This was NT trash talk or psychological warfare. This was a declaration of faith that transformed a military encounter into a spiritual battle. David understood that the real conflict wasn't between Israel and Philistia, or between a boy and a giant, but between the living God and the false gods that Goliath represented. The outcome wasn't going to be determined by size or strength or military technology, but by which God was real and powerful. Goliath charged forward, his massive frame covering ground quickly despite his heavy armor. But as he approached, David ran toward him, reaching into his shepherd's bag, placing a smooth stone in his sling, and beginning the circular motion that would generate incredible velocity. The sling wasn't a toy, in the hands of an expert. It was a precision weapon capable of launching a stone at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. David had probably made this same motion thousands of times, protecting his sheep from predators, practicing his accuracy during long afternoons in the hills. His aim was perfect, his timing was flawless, and the stone struck Goliath in the only unprotected part of his body, his forehead, right between the eyes. The impact was devastating. The giant who had terrorized an entire army for 40 days collapsed face first onto the ground, killed instantly by a stone thrown by a teenager. The silence that followed must have been deafening. For a moment, nobody on either side could process what they had just witnessed. The invincible champion was dead, killed by the most unlikely warrior imaginable. Then David ran forward, drew Goliath's own sword from its sheath, and cut off the giant's head, just as he had promised. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. The Philistine army, which had seemed so confident behind their champion, suddenly realized they were facing a people whose God was more powerful than their gods, whose faith was stronger than their military technology. They turned and fled in panic, abandoning their camp and their weapons, running for their lives back toward their own territory. The Israelite army, which had been paralyzed by fear just minutes earlier, suddenly found their courage and gave chase, pursuing the fleeing Philistines and winning a complete victory. The 40-day standoff was over, decided in less than a minute by a shepherd boy who understood that the battle belonged to the Lord. But David's story was just beginning. King Saul brought him into his court, where he became best friends with the king's son Jonathan and eventually married Saul's daughter Michal. David's military success continued, and he became a hero throughout Israel, inspiring songs that declared, "Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." However, success brought new challenges. King Saul became jealous of David's popularity and began trying to kill him, forcing David to flee into the wilderness where he had learned to trust God as a shepherd boy. For years, David lived as a fugitive, hiding in caves and desert strongholds, pursued by the very king he had served faithfully. During those wilderness years, David's faith was tested in ways completely different from the Goliath encounter. Instead of one dramatic moment of victory, he faced years of uncertainty, injustice, and apparent defeat. Yet he continued to trust God, refusing opportunities to kill Saul when they presented themselves, waiting for God's timing rather than taking matters into his own hands. Eventually, David became king of Israel and ruled for 40 years, transforming the nation from a collection of tribes into a powerful, united kingdom. He conquered Jerusalem and made it his capital, brought the Ark of the Covenant there, and received God's promise that his descendants would rule forever, a promise ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who was born in David's hometown of Bethlehem and called the Son of David. But the victory over Goliath remained the defining moment of David's life, the event that revealed his character and his faith most clearly. It showed that he was someone who saw situations from God's perspective rather than human perspective, who trusted divine power more than human strength, who was willing to act on his faith even when everyone around him was paralyzed by fear. What can we learn from this incredible story? First, that size doesn't determine strength, and circumstances don't determine outcomes. The giant looked unbeatable, but he was fighting against God, which made him the underdog regardless of his physical advantages. Second, that God often chooses the most unlikely people to accomplish his purposes. David wasn't chosen because he was the biggest, strongest, or most experienced warrior in Israel. He was chosen because he had the faith to see God's power as greater than any human challenge. Third, that the skills and experiences we develop in obscurity often prepare us for the moments when we recalled into the spotlight. David's years of lonely shepherding, learning to protect his flock with a sling, weren't wasted time. They were preparation for the most important 5 minutes of his life. Fourth, that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's faith in action despite fear. David must have been nervous about facing Goliath, but he was more concerned about God's honor than his own safety. Finally, that what looks impossible from a human perspective may be simple from God's perspective. The Israelite army saw an unwinnable fight against superior technology and overwhelming physical advantage. David saw an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power and faithfulness. The story of David and Goliath has inspired underdogs and outcasts for 3,000 years because it reminds us that ordinary people, armed with faith and willing to act on that faith, can accomplish extraordinary things. It teaches us that the battles we face aren't ultimately won by superior weapons or human strength, but by trust in the God who controls the outcome of every conflict. David's victory over Goliath was just about one boy defeating one giant. It was about faith triumphing over fear, about divine power overcoming human limitations, about the importance of seeing our challenges from God's perspective rather than our own. It reminds us that no giant is too big for God, no challenge too overwhelming, no situation too hopeless when we approach it with genuine faith and willingness to act on that faith. The next time you face your own giant, whether it's a seemingly impossible challenge, an overwhelming fear, or a situation where you feel completely outmatched, remember David. Remember that the same God who enabled a shepherd boy to defeat a giant warrior is still alive, still powerful, and still looking for people who are willing to trust him completely, even when everyone else thinks the odds are impossible. Sometimes the most extraordinary victories come through the most ordinary people who simply believe that God is bigger than whatever giant they're facing.